This lesson will continuing to cover the book of Exodus from the 10th final plague of Egypt to the crossing of the Red Sea. And you can see here in chapter 11 that this one will be the death of all the firstborn in Egypt, from the animals to right into Pharaoh's own son, as payback for the order to murder all the male babies born to the Hebrews, because God reserves the right to avenge. Some people think that's evil, but it's not. It's justice. And this person has been claiming to be God, this Pharaoh, and God is showing him that I'm God and you're not, basically. So there are reasons for this, and it's God's prerogative to do whatever he wants, which by definition is right because he defines right and wrong. So he will take revenge, and this is all the issue with circumcising males and all these things about having males as priests and firstborn dedicated. It's all related to this issue of Pharaoh wanting to kill all the baby Hebrew boys. But with this plague, the individual Israelites will only be spared if they put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their houses, so the death angel passes them by. We could argue over whether this death angel is an angel or God himself, but doesn't really matter, because either way, this is the origin of Passover, the festival, which is rich with symbolic reference to the eventual Passover lamb, which Jesus was. And speaking of rich, before God begins this plague, the people of Israel are to ask the Egyptian people for silver and gold jewelry and other articles and whatever clothing they can spare, and the people of Egypt give generously to them. They're happy to get rid of them because at this point, Moses finally has the respect of not only Egyptian people, but also even Pharaoh's court, it says. So this is, as the Bible says, how they plunder the Egyptians. Now, if we go down to verse 4, it seems to backtrack a bit to add the last thing Moses says to Pharaoh, which I mentioned briefly before, that he has something else to say that wasn't recorded then. And he tells him about this final plague and that Pharaoh's own servants will bow to him, Moses. Yet not even the loss of his firstborn son will persuade Pharaoh to concede the God of Israel for very long. He will for a time, as his habit is, but doesn't last long. So that was the heated exchange just before he left Pharaoh's court for the last time. And then in chapter 12, before the death angel arrives, God tells Moses and Aaron to mark this month as the first month of the year for Israel, roughly equivalent to late March, early April. And on the 10th day of the month, each household is to select a flawless 1-year-old male sheep, or goat it will turn out later, and observe it till the 14th. And on that afternoon, they're to slaughter all the lambs. Then they're to smear some of its blood on the top and sides of the door frame of their house. And then we see down here in verse 8 that they have to eat the meat that night after roasting it over a fire along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And the people have to dress as if they're prepared to leave in a hurry. But with the blood on the doorpost, they'd be safe from the death angel. But the leaving doesn't have to do with escaping the death angel. It has to do with them actually leaving Egypt in the middle of the night. So as I mentioned earlier, this is symbolizing what Jesus would eventually fulfill. Now we have a link in the description, the life of Jesus timeline, and you can look at that for exactly how, detail by detail, how Jesus fulfilled this, especially point 5c, and we'll take a look at that at the end of this lesson. But that's an optional part that you wouldn't have to watch. You could check that out later on your own if you want. But the immediate context is God's vengeance against Egypt and Pharaoh in particular. And as we go down here to verse 14, we see that since this is supposed to be a perpetual memorial, it means much more than just the immediate context. So God adds another requirement. For 7 days, the people must not eat anything with yeast in it, not even have any yeast in their houses. Later in the scriptures, we'll see that yeast is symbolic of sin that infects the whole group. It only takes a tiny bit. And the first and last days of that week will be holy days or Sabbaths when no work except food prep can be done. And this whole week will be known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread for that reason, which means unleavened, without yeast. And it begins on the evening of the 14th and ends on the evening of the 21st, with the 15th beginning the actual Passover day. since days begin after sunset. We have to remember that, and the timeline of Jesus will help to clear that up. But the 14th would become known as the preparation day, and this is an important detail when we study that final week. In other words, they would, if they had to have all yeast purged from their homes by the start of the 15th, then the 14th they had to prepare. That's why it's preparation day. So they would spend that day getting all the yeast out. So now let's go down to verse 21. And when Moses passes all this information to the elders of Israel, he adds that no one is allowed to leave their house either until morning. So even though this happens, I might have misspoke earlier, this happens in the middle of the night, they don't leave till daybreak. So then he repeats that this will be a reminder for all their generations of the night when God overpowered and humiliated all other claims of godhood. And this establishment of a national calendar, whose first month was called Abib or Aviv, after the barley harvest, I think, and then it would be changed after the Babylonian captivity to Nisan. This is the first step toward making the people of Israel into the nation of Israel, formally and politically, I guess you could say, at least religiously. But this will not really be finalized and formal until they have a covenant drawn up, some kind of document. And that won't happen until they reach the mountain that God told Moses he would return to and the people would worship him there. So this takes some time, this whole process. I didn't mean to scroll that. And, well, maybe I did. We're ready to go on to verse 29 anyway. And that's where we see that the death angel arrives in the middle of the night. And by the time it's over, not a single house in Egypt was spared. And finally, Pharaoh lets Israel go, but he still has the gall to ask Moses and Aaron to bless him first. Why he would even try that, I don't know, but at least he has humiliated himself in a way, because he realizes that the lesser is blessed by the greater. And so he's saying, you know, he's been thinking he's a god all this time, and now he's asking for the blessing of Moses and Aaron's God. Now, the rest of the Egyptian people couldn't be more motivated to expel the Hebrews at this point, so they give them anything they want. And again, this is the plundering of Egypt. So now, verse 37, and we see that they finally go, they've got all their plunder, and they go off, and they first go to the city of Ramses. And again, we mentioned that in an earlier lesson, that it doesn't mean that Pharaoh Ramses had been alive then, but that Moses is using a more modern name for a place that people would recognize when he actually goes to write this stuff, because he's obviously writing from a future date about the past events. That's why it's called that. And then they go to a place called Sukkoth. I guess that's how you pronounce it. And this is where we mentioned also in an earlier lesson about the 600,000 men of fighting age. And then verse 40 there is another place where Scripture cites the 430 years as how long the Israelites lived in Egypt. But we have to remember to balance this with all the other references, as we saw in the timeline chart from Abraham to Moses. And that time span goes all the way back to when Abraham was given the promise. And he was in Egypt, and then he left, and then he came back. And this passage is treating that all as just a summary time in Egypt. So we have to keep that in mind. And I've lost track of my cursor again. There it is. We're trying to go to verse 43. And that's where God adds another stipulation for the Passover observance. No foreigner is allowed to participate unless the males are circumcised. The meal can't be shared outside the house either, and none of the sheep's bones are to be broken. These will have their final fulfillment at Jesus' crucifixion, which had to happen in Israel, the house, and none of his bones were broken. So, again, there's always reasons for these things. So then we go to chapter 13. And we see there that God declares that all the firstborn males, human or animal, are to be consecrated to God, which means set apart and somehow separated. That's what holiness is. It's separation. And the stipulation for the festival are stated again as well. And we already went over why the firstborn males, but he gives another repeat of all these requirements for the festival down here in verse 11. And he also clarifies that this all begins when they reach Canaan, also known as the Promised Land. And the reason the firstborn males to belong to God is because of Pharaoh's attempt to kill them all again. So we can't overemphasize that point, that this is the reason for that emphasis on the males is not because of some fleshly superiority or being more human or more preferred by God. It's to symbolize something, and that something was Pharaoh's order to kill all the male babies in Egypt among the Hebrews. So now let's go down to verse 17. And God decides that Israel should not go through the land of the Philistines, even though it was a shorter route to the Promised Land, or they might turn back to Egypt. And that they might also do so if war broke out, since, as if you check Constable's notes, the route was heavily fortified by the Egyptians. They had a route that they guarded, and so it was likely that they would go back to the Egyptian side if a war happened, because they had lived there. And there's an old saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't know. They would go back to Egypt rather than deal with whoever attacked the area. Or if even the Egyptians attacked the area, they would side with them. So God says, no, we're not going that way. And they go toward the wilderness by the Red Sea. And this happens in what the text calls the fifth generation. And again, go back and check that timeline chart. And this is where it says that Moses remembered to bring the bones of the patriarch Joseph along with them. So that is fulfilled. And by day, God would lead them with what is called a pillar of cloud, and by night a pillar of fire. They were probably the same object, because the fire would be less helpful during the day, obviously, and of course at night you wouldn't see the cloud. So it's probably one object, depending on what time of day or night it was. So now we go down to chapter 14, and God sets up basically the final nail in Egypt's coffin. He has Israel camp in such a way that they're strategically trapped between the wilderness and the sea to lure Pharaoh into seizing the opportunity to enslave them again. Because in spite of everything, Pharaoh and his officials can't imagine why they let all those slaves go. And later we'll see that it isn't just the Egyptians who have the memory and sense of a goldfish. But off they go, and with their entire army, and catch up to them at this camp. And of course they think their God is a poor strategist, and they're going to wipe them out, or at least wipe out enough of them that they can take the rest back as slaves again. So now we go down here to verse 10, and it says that the Israelites, in an equally goldfish level reaction, forget all they've just seen God do, and they whine to Moses, "So this is why you took us out here to die, because there wasn't room enough for our graves in Egypt. We were better off as slaves than to die out here." Of course, Moses has to remind them not to be such sniveling cowards, but to sit back and watch the show as God takes care of business for them, because this was never about them in the first place as far as conquering and strength and all these things. This was always God's doing, and he was doing it for them, not because they were so awesome, but because God made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he intends to keep them no matter what. So now we go down to verse 15. And this is where God has Moses hold the staff in his hand over the sea so that people can cross on dry ground. According to Constable's notes, the phrase Yam Soup is not Egyptian for sea of reeds, as a lot of critics claim, which means a shallow marsh. And so they try to say, no, this wasn't a miracle. That's not what it means. It's a Hebrew phrase for the sea at the end. And besides, the entire large and sophisticated army of Egypt would not drown in a marsh, unless we want to say that they were all drooling idiots, which the burden of proof would be on the critics. But God also tells Moses that once Israel begins to cross over, the Egyptians will chase after them, so they know this ahead of time, but it'll be their undoing when they do start to chase in after them. So now at this point, since the Egyptian army has caught up to them and they need a little more time to cross, the pillar of cloud and fire moves between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. So now it's behind the Israelites, and it causes this palpable darkness again and gloom, and it keeps the two groups apart during the night. And then meanwhile, verse 21, Moses does as he's instructed, and God brings a strong wind to make a dry path through the sea. You wonder again why God doesn't just snap his fingers and do this, but he does things the way he decides is the best way to do them, and that's just how it is. It's a miracle either way. And the water forms these walls on either side, and this, of course, would keep Egypt from going around ahead of them and surrounding them. But the people get all across. By morning, the Egyptians see them and commence their pursuit, because now the pillar is apparently not in the way. But God slows them down even more by putting them into a panic, it says, and jamming their chariot wheels. Some translations have that the wheels were coming off. So when they finally realize that God himself is fighting for Israel, they try to retreat. And this is a good thing to remember when people are, in our own daily lives, that when we want to pray for God's mercy or something, we can say, pray about having God put whatever it is into a panic, or having, jamming its chariot wheels. This is just kind of a thing you can remember sometimes. But then we go down to verse 26, and it says that Israel had crossed the sea by this time, and God has Moses hold out the staff again to cause the waters to return. And the next morning, the Israelites could look across and see all the drowned Egyptians on the far shore. No survivors. Everybody's been drowned in the Egyptian army, though it's doubtful that Pharaoh himself had gone with them instead of staying on high ground to direct the assault. That's how you did things in those days. The top commanders, the generals and kings, the highest ranking, would stand up on a hill to get a view of the whole battlefield and give orders from there. So it was likely that Pharaoh was not drowned, but either way, he had no army at all anymore, and no son to succeed him to the throne of Egypt, which for a self-proclaimed God is quite embarrassing. So God has thoroughly humiliated Pharaoh and Egypt, and at least for now, all the people of Israel honor and trust God and his servants Moses and Aaron. For now. Emphasis on just for now. So we should know by now that this doesn't last a whole lot of time. And we'll find out more in the next lesson. These things are always short-lived. But what I want to do right now is, again, this is the optional extension to the lesson. We've done this before. And we're going to take a quick look at that article on Jesus' final week. And this is from my website. I have a link to it up in the description. And this is, you can see point 1 there is referring to Exodus 12, where the first instructions were given, specifying the 10th of Nisan. As I mentioned, that was the post-Babylonian name for Aviv, or Aviv, depending on how you pronounce it. Aviv, I don't know. Anyway, the flawless year-old male lamb or goat was to be selected for each family, kept under observation for any defects until the 14th. And then at twilight, which is a term that could be very loosely interpreted to any time after noon before sunset. So this is when they were to be slaughtered, and then they were to be eaten at sundown. And this marked, as mentioned, the start of a 7-day period, beginning and ending with a Sabbath or sacred assembly, and all these had to be purged. So the 14th was the preparation day, 15th the actual Passover, and the whole festival was called Passover as well. So regardless of the Gregorian calendar dates, we know that it was, as far as the Israeli calendar dates, the 14th was the preparation, the Passover was the 15th. So then we see that Jesus visited Bethany 6 days before the Passover, according to John 12:1, which would have been Nisan 9, counting back from those Passover dates. 6 days before the Passover, we subtract that from the 15 and we get 9. And then point 3 there, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem was the next day after that. So according to John 12:12, that would be when he was kept under observation as the Passover lambs and goats. So as stated in Exodus 12 again, this was Nisan 10. And toward the end of that day, according to Mark 11:10 and forward, Jesus briefly visited the temple and then went to Bethany for the night. And the next day, Nisan 11, Jesus is driving the merchants from the temple. Now, there's 2 incidences of that, as far as I think the Gospel of John has it, one early and one late here, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, Nisan 12 is the next day, and that's when the religious leaders begin to strongly challenge Jesus. And according to Mark 14, it says the Passover at that point was 2 days away. But the Passover feast, the whole thing, so that meant the 14th as far as we've been calculating as we go along here. So the preparation day, the 14th, began at sundown with the Last Supper, according to John 13:1. That's the day begins at sundown. We have to remember that, and I'll explain that in a bit. And the next daylight, which was to us the next day on the calendar, but it was still the same day, part of the preparation, according to John 19, verses 14, 31, and 42. And that's when Jesus was on those mock trials, illegal trials. And point 8 here shows that it explains that the 24-hour day in Israel began at sundown, was divided into segments called hours or watches as relates to guard duty. Each hour was really a 3-hour span, but it was known by its beginning. So the third hour lasted from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, counting from either 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. So going by the position of the sun or moon made greater precision impractical, but more importantly, the expressions the third hour and almost or about the 6th hour refer to the same 3-hour span, with the latter meaning that it was close to the end of that span, and I give a reference there that you can look up. And then in point 9, Jesus was condemned according to that at about 11 a.m. It was near the end of that 3-hour span, according to John 19:14, and that he would have been crucified at about noon, according to Mark 15:25. So point 10, Jesus died about 3 hours after 3 hours of darkness, which would have started from the time he was put on the cross until 3 p.m., according to Mark 15:33, after which his body was taken down by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were both Pharisees, who wrapped and buried his body, according to John 19:38-42. And this was at sundown on the 14th, just before the Passover itself began on the 15th. And then point 11 here, there were 2 Sabbaths that week by deduction, since Mark 16:1 has women buying burial spices after the Sabbath, while Luke 23:56 has them buying the spices before the Sabbath. The first on Nisan 15 was the special Sabbath or Passover, and the second on Nisan 17 was normal weekly Sabbath. They had to have a day between those two to meet the requirement of buying them both before and after a Sabbath. And this burial custom, the scripture says he was buried according to custom. The need for haste had to do with which tomb he was put in, not with the burial process itself, which is more like what we'd think of as a mummy. They would wrap long strips of cloth that they would wrap each leg separately, and between the windings, they would put this mixture of spices, not only to mask the smell, but also to act as a glue or a cement. So they're wrapping up each leg separately and interweaving it with this mixture, and then they would wrap up the torso up to the armpits. Then they would wrap the arms and then cross them over the chest, and then continue the wrapping of the strips up to the neck. And then they would stop there and put basically a sack, a bag made out of cloth over the head, and they also call that the sweat cloth. And the scriptures say that after his resurrection that sweat cloth, that's the name of it in the Greek, is found separate from the rest of the grave clothes. Well, that's because the rest of the grave clothes were all glued together in strips like a mummy. So what does this say about the Shroud of Turin? Whatever it was, I know what it wasn't. It wasn't Jesus' burial cloth, because that Shroud of Turin is a sheet, an entire body-length sheet, which they did not do in Israel at that time. He was wrapped like a mummy, and the headpiece was separate. So much for the Shroud of Turin. It doesn't matter. We don't need that for a proof of Jesus' resurrection anyway. So, and point 9 here, since the preparation that year was 3 days before the normal Sabbath, since, again, by deduction, we had to have a day between 2 Sabbaths so the women could buy both before and after, that means that since the normal Sabbath was always sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, then Jesus had to be crucified on a Wednesday. I know there's a lot of dispute over that, but since the triumphal entry, if that's true, was on Nisan 10 and the 15th was a Thursday, then the triumphal entry had to be on a Sabbath, meaning a Saturday. So this whole Palm Sunday thing, don't get dogmatic about it, because we could be wrong. And I know there are a lot of indignation over anybody saying he was crucified on Friday and rose on Sunday, and Palm Sunday was the week before. It's not, so to speak, a hill to die on, that, but it is a matter of defending the scriptures against critics if you run into that sort of thing. This is at least a plausible scenario, in my opinion. So, at any rate, the most important thing is that Jesus fulfilled this symbolism that is being given in Exodus for all these, what seem to us, inexplicable rules that God was making that seemed to be over the top as far as symbolizing just what was happening then with the Exodus, with leaving Egypt. So when we tie these things together as scripture, we see again that they all turn out to have very good reasons for their symbolism. And that's why later we'll find out why, when Moses doesn't precisely obey God's command about getting water for the Israelites, that this was a severe punishment that he was going to get for that. Because symbols matter to God, because he's telling us something, and these things have to be done a certain way. So we'll take a look at the next, in the next lesson, we'll go on to their actual leaving Egypt, leaving the whole land of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea, but they have farther to go yet. They are not even close to, they haven't got to the mountain of God or anything like that. So we'll get to that next time.